The movie starts with Frank Valera getting out of his car and entering a restaurant. Frank seems very quiet. Even when the waitress brings him the menu and coffee, he says nothing. But Frank has very sharp hearing. He can even hear whispers from far away. Because of this, he hears voices from the kitchen. He stands up, goes into the kitchen, and locks the door. Then, he suddenly attacks a chef. The scene then goes back in time. Frank is busy working in his office. He used to be a successful and ambitious lawyer. He lived in a big house with his wife, Sue Valera, and daughter, Olivia Valera. But his busy job made it hard for him to spend time with his family. One day, Olivia calls Frank because he promised to watch her school show. But Olivia is disappointed when she checks the stands and only sees her mother. Frank tried to be there on time, but he was stuck at work. After he finished, he rushed to the show, but he was too late. The show was over. Frank went home, but Sue and Olivia were not back yet. He waited anxiously. Frank's worry grew when the police came to his house. They told him that Sue and Olivia had died. They took Frank to the train yard, where the bodies were found in a pit. Frank tried to rush over to hug them, but the police stopped him. Sue and Olivia's funeral was very sad. Many people came, including Frank's father-in-law, Chuck. Chuck never liked Frank, and after Sue and Olivia's deaths, he hated Frank even more. Chuck blamed Frank and his greed for their deaths. Frank only defended rich and important people, even if they were guilty. Chuck told Frank he never wanted to hear from him again. After the funeral, Frank felt very guilty. He spent a lot of time sitting in Olivia's room and reading her notes. One day, Frank went to the police station to ask about the case. He met with Lustiger, the detective. Lustiger said they found golden threads at the crime scene, but it was not enough evidence. Angry at the slow progress, Frank expressed his sorrow by getting drunk. One evening, after drinking a lot, Frank went to a bar and went downstairs. There, he saw a wild fight with a big crowd watching. Drunk, Frank provoked one of the fighters to hit him. The next day, Frank joined the fight. He did this because he felt guilty about not protecting Sue and Olivia. But Frank had no fighting skills, so he was easily beaten by the other fighters. He often came home with a bruised face. One day, he was seriously injured by a fighter, but a policeman named Hank Strode saved him. Strode was the cop who had taken Frank to the train yard. At a cafe, Strode told Frank that he also fought in the illegal fights to relieve stress. He was surprised to see Frank there. Strode then said that the investigation into Sue and Olivia's deaths was on hold. Frank was very angry when he heard this, but could do nothing. One night, a young girl approached Frank on his way home. She offered herself to him, but Frank refused because she was too young. Soon, a man came to take the girl away. Frank didn't want the girl to be forced into child prostitution, so he confronted the man. The man beat Frank until he bled. Frank fought back, but the girl stabbed him in the left thigh, making him fall into a bookstore window. He landed on a pile of bookshelves and used a book to stop the bleeding. He then hid from the police. While hiding, Frank read the book he used to stop his wound. It was about Marcus Aurelius' meditations. He read about the punishment for crimes for those who confessed. This book gave Frank the motivation to learn martial arts. He began to train hard in various martial arts, like karate and boxing. At first, Frank was easily beaten by his coaches. But his skills improved, and he eventually beat his karate coach during practice. His boxing punches also became stronger. One day, Frank drew a line over the mouth of a man on a book cover he was reading. This meant he vowed not to speak until he got revenge on his wife and daughter's killers. After that, his hearing became sharper, and he could hear even the smallest sounds. The next day, Frank went to the place where Sue and Olivia's bodies were found. There, he saw a container filled with furniture, like a house. The container had a hole overlooking where the bodies were found. Not finding any clues, Frank went back to his car parked near an overpass. When he got there, he saw 4 thugs trying to break into his car. They forced him to give them his car keys. Frank, who had vowed not to speak, stayed silent as the thugs threatened him. One of the thugs ordered his dog to attack Frank, but the dog only barked and didn't attack. When Frank glared at the dog, it ran away. A fight broke out with the 4 thugs attacking Frank at the same time. Frank defeated them all. He then grabbed one thug and showed him a picture of Sue and Olivia. The thug didn't know anything about the murders, so Frank let him go. As Frank was about to get into his car, the thug shot him. Even though he was injured, Frank managed to beat the thug. The dog that had run away came back and approached Frank after seeing he was hurt. The thugs ran away, leaving Frank unconscious beside his car. When Frank woke up, he was in a house with a nurse named Alma. Alma told Frank she found him at the train yard. Frank didn't speak and left without thanking her, even though Alma wanted to treat his wound. Outside Alma's house, the dog was waiting for Frank. The dog followed him, so Frank decided to take the dog home. Every day, Frank kept gathering evidence to find Sue and Olivia's killers. He collected newspaper clippings and photographs related to the case. One afternoon, Alma came to return Frank's wallet that he left at her house. Frank invited her in. Alma figured out why Frank refused to speak. Frank showed her the photo of Sue and Olivia and the evidence he had gathered. With Alma's help, Frank identified the person living in the container near the crime scene. This person, Alma said, worked in a restaurant. Frank then went to the restaurant to meet the container's occupant, a cook known as Mr. Shivers. This scene appears at the beginning of the film when Frank interrogates Mr. Shivers. Frank beats Mr. Shivers badly before showing him a picture of Sue and Olivia. Mr. Shivers finally confesses that he saw their murder, but he couldn't see the killer's face clearly. He could only confirm that the killer wore a police uniform and left the crime scene in a car. Mr. Shivers admitted that he only took money from a wallet left in Sue's car and then threw the wallet away. To check Mr. Shivers' story, Frank goes back to the crime scene, this time with his new dog, who proves very useful. The dog finds Sue's purse in a manhole. Frank then goes to the police station, where he sneaks into Detective Lustiger's room and looks at the data on his computer. Frank wants to know which police officers were on duty when Sue and Olivia died. To his surprise, he sees Strode's name. Frank can't believe what he finds and doubts that Strode killed his wife. To find out more, Frank follows Strode everywhere for 7 days and nights. One day, Frank follows Strode to his house and sees Strode leaving. Frank sneaks into the house looking for evidence. In the living room, he sees a photo of Strode with his young daughter. Then, in the wardrobe, he finds one of Strode's police uniforms with a gold thread loose from an embroidered sleeve badge. The gold thread reminds Frank of the evidence Lustiger found earlier. Curious, Frank looks deeper into Strode's wardrobe. He finds a secret passage in the cupboard that leads to a backpack. Inside the backpack, there are several magazines reporting on Frank attending Sue and Olivia's funeral and on Frank as a lawyer. One news article reports that Frank had succeeded in freeing the person who murdered Strode's daughter. That afternoon, when Strode came home, he found a photo tucked under his car's windshield wiper. On the back of the photo, Frank wrote a message asking Strode to meet him at Kingsman Station at 11 p.m. Their meeting place was an empty warehouse at the station. Strode got out of his car carefully, but Frank was hiding. He suddenly attacked Strode, and they started fighting. Both were equally skilled in martial arts. At the end of the fight, Frank had a chance to stab Strode but decided to let him live. Frank managed to control his desire for revenge. At the end of the film, Frank is seen leaving the courthouse after attending Strode's trial, where Strode was convicted of his crimes. After that, Frank, with Alma by his side, visits the graves of Sue and Olivia. In front of the graves, Frank ends his vow of silence. The first words he says are, "I love you." So the moral of the story is, if you don't show up for your kid's school play, you might end up becoming a martial arts master, befriending a stray dog, and solving crimes in your spare time.